Good to be with you all this morning again. So we're going to continue this week our month-long series with our college kids who are back from school on vacation, preaching the word on Sunday morning. Last week, I was overjoyed by Travis's sermon that he gave us last week. I just had a permanent smile on my face for several days after that. I was so excited to see him do that. This week, we've got my son, Tyler. I recall Tyler being on the front row at our Pew Packers on Wednesday night for years and years here. And, he made a lot of effort to make sure he was there. We would leave baseball practice early. We made a lot of sacrifice to be there every Wednesday night. But I tell you what, learning those basic Bible facts was very powerful for him. And it's very powerful for all of our young kids to put in that time, that effort, that discipline to learn those basic Bible facts. I'll never forget Tyler when he was a freshman in high school at Scottsdale Prep in the science class, and they were going through the evolution portion of the coursework. And he stymied the teacher. It was a fairly young biology teacher who really had no learning or training in really evolutionary philosophies or evolutionary ideas. And when Tyler challenged her, it was embarrassing for her. And we learned later, through friends of ours that were teachers at the school, that teacher had to go to other teachers at the school to try and figure out, how do I handle this? Because I don't know how to respond to some of his objections to evolution. And so the impact that our kids can have with proper training, proper education, proper scriptural knowledge is amazing. Even as kids, how they can influence adults and teachers and people in authority. And that's what we need. We've got to raise up leaders not only in the church, but leaders in the world that stand for truth. So I'm very proud for Tyler to bring us the lesson this morning. If you don't know, Tyler, a few months ago, preached at the Prescott Valley Church of Christ, and they very quickly have instituted him as a once-a-month speaker at the Prescott Valley Church of Christ. So if you're ever in the mood to take a trip up to Prescott Valley one Sunday morning to listen to Tyler preach, I encourage you to do that. We'll probably be there. The scripture reading I'm going to read for Tyler this morning is going to come from John chapter 15, and it's verses 12 through 13. Jesus is describing in these couple of verses a commandment that he has for his disciples, and he also describes what the greatest form of love is in these two verses. He says in verse 12 of John chapter 15, "This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends."
Good morning, church. Like my dad said, I'm Tyler. I'm a senior right now up at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Prescott. I got one semester left. I'm also in Air Force ROTC there in May. I'm going to commission in the Air Force as a second lieutenant. When I was first called to do this lesson, it was from Prescott Valley Church of Christ. And they called and I asked them, okay, well, what do you want me to talk about, really? They just called and asked if I wanted to preach. I didn't even know who was on the other end of the phone there. And they said, well, we need someone to talk about Christian leadership and principles. And I asked why specifically. And they said, well, they had a lot of bad experiences with their elders up there, and that really had been robbed by them and had seen horrible examples of leadership. And so they said, we need someone to come and talk about what leadership is supposed to look like. And so I said, okay, well, I think I can do that. And so I went up there and I did this lesson. However, I do think it's applicable no matter where you are. It doesn't have to just be at a congregation where the leadership has failed them. I think it's always applicable no matter who you are, whether you're in a leadership position currently or not. Why is that so? We're called to be lights unto the world. Jesus says, let your light shine before men that they may see your good works and praise your Father who is in heaven. So again, every day we're called to be leaders in Christ. We're called to be the example to other people, whether you're out in the street and whether people see you, if they know you're a Christian, they're always looking at you. And so it's incredibly important then to know what is leadership. How do we exemplify leadership? How do we exemplify, more importantly, Christian leadership? And so when I began thinking about that, I thought this should be easy for me because a lot of our classes, we have Air Force class there for ROTC, and they are trying to turn kids who are kids that just came out of high school, and they said in 4 years, you're going to have to be an officer, and you're going to outrank 80% of the military, and you're going to have to go straight from being in college to making life or death decisions for people. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you might have to be responsible for millions and millions of dollars worth of equipment. And you're going to, at the end of the day, have to answer for what happens with that. And so how do you take someone fresh out of high school and in 4 years turn them into someone that you can confidently say, he's got this, and I trust them with whatever responsibility they're giving them, whether they're a maintenance officer or a pilot or no matter what they do. And so they teach us different styles of leadership, and they tell us to experiment with it and find out what works for you. And so they talked about transactional leadership. And transactional leadership, they said, was, well, you give them something, and in return, they'll do something for you. And the example that they gave us in the class is minimum wage work. You know, you're working at McDonald's or TJ Maxx, and they pay you and you do work for them. And that's transactional leadership. And that didn't really strike me as leadership. That's more management. You manage resources, you lead people. Okay, so how is that leadership? I didn't really buy that. And they talk about transformational leadership, where you help them fulfill who they really are, and you help them realize like self-actualization. You help them realize what their real potential is. And that seemed closer to me, but still seemed kind of wishy-washy, and they didn't really give hard detail. How do you do that? What is that? What does that look like, actually? And again, there's not really concrete details there. And then they talked about servant leadership. And this is, okay, I've heard this before, heard servant leadership before. And they start talking about that. And they always talk about the Southwest Airlines case study, where they say, well, Southwest Airlines found that they really take care of their people, that they make more money doing that. And that's should be something that other businesses should emulate. And so all these businesses now started copying that, saying, well, if we really care about our people, they'll put out more for us. And then at the end of the day, our bottom line is better. And again, that doesn't really strike me as leadership, just more as this is how you make more money. And that's, again, different in my mind. And they teach it like it's something new. Like they've just discovered this servant, what is servant leadership? And they just discovered it and they're teaching it. And that struck me as ridiculous because, again, we all know that servant leadership is a biblical concept, is biblical leadership at its core, because diakonos, the word for deacon, means servant leader. And we see it in all aspects of the Bible. We see it in Old Testament and New Testament, and it's at its core, it's a large part of what Jesus teaches to us. And so I'm going to have 3 points in my lesson, and it's hard to distinguish them in some ways because I don't feel like you can do one without doing the others. They all connect. And so really, what is servant leadership? At its core, it's centered around trust. And Colin Powell, used to be Secretary of State, used to be in the Army, said that the biggest thing he learned in the Army was that no matter how cold you are, you can't appear cold. No matter how hungry you are, you must not appear hungry. No matter how tired you are, you must not appear tired, because then your men, they see you being cold, tired, and hungry. Well, then they're going to be cold, tired, and hungry. And he said, if your men really trust you, they're going to follow you no matter what you're doing, if only out of curiosity. So how do you develop trust then? The first thing that came to mind is to be utterly selfless, no matter what's going on, though. And that's the hard part. It's not a complicated or hard to understand concept, but its application can be incredibly, incredibly difficult. It's best summarized to me as leaders eat last. Only when your people are taken care of do you get to eat. Only when they have water do you get to drink. And we see this 1 Corinthians 13, agape love. We see that laid out for us. Again, all of these are principles that people in the secular world have come and discovered and are trying to teach some variation of it. But it's not a new concept. Nothing is new. Like King Solomon tells us, nothing is new under the sun. It's all here already, and it's all given to us in the Word. So 1 Corinthians 13, we have verse 4, love is patient, love is kind. It is not envy, it is not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. The translations may say, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That right there, if you had to give someone one verse of the Bible to tell them this is what Christianity is about, it should be this one. Maybe a close second, John 15:13, what our scripture reading was. And it just lays out, this is who we're supposed to be as Christians, if nothing else. Because if you do these things, you're automatically going to align with God's principles, that we love one another just as he loved us, from, again, John 15:13. Again, in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:46, is when he begins preaching to the Israelites what agape love is, without calling it as such. But if you examine the Sermon on the Mount, you really see that's what he's getting at, that you love your enemies just as they love you. But Matthew 5:46, he says, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? And if you only love those if you greet those who greet you, what, isn't that what other people are doing already? He's really preaching agape love here. And this is part of, at the end of the sermon, many of the Israelites said this is hard to follow. And he lost many of his disciples that day because they said, we can't do this. How are we supposed to love our enemies as we love ourselves? And so really at the end of the day, we're called to be completely selfless. Again, if you look back at 1 Corinthians 13, it's all about, are other people taken care of first? And again, is there any section of that focuses on the self there? I'd be hard pressed to point out a single one. So again, it's easy to do when everything's going well, though. That's one of the things I've learned from a lot of the trainings they've put us through for the military, is that it's easy to do when everything's going well. Just about a month ago, we did, for my Special Forces prep group, we did a 2-day long screener. I've been through week-long screeners to try out for Special Forces. And at the beginning of the exercise, at the beginning of the week, it's always everyone is gung-ho, is on each other's side. And if someone slips up, it's fine. We all got each other's back. If you fast forward 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, you've had only a few hours of sleep. You've only had a couple meals, not even meals that come out of a bag and it's cold. And you've been doing exercise nonstop, and you've been getting yelled at for things that aren't your fault, and you're getting punished for it. And then you see the light at the end of the tunnel, and the guy next to you messes up something simple. His water bottle is more than this far away from us, not within arm's reach. Put his water bottle over there. Boom. Now you got 500 more push-ups. Now you got 500 more burpees. Right when you had 10 left. You had 10 left, and then he messes up. Is it so easy to forgive someone when you're hurting, when you're so close to the finish line, and then you're just thrown further back than you were? 1 step forward, 3 back, right? So it's easy to do when everything is going well. And that's, again, a huge lesson that we see in the story of Job. And Job had everything going for him. He was the richest man in the land. And again, Travis talked about this in his lesson last week. But he had everything. And in the blink of an eye, all his possessions are taken from him, and his children are killed, and everything around him comes crashing down. And again, he refuses to curse God. And we see that in Job chapter 2. And the devil comes back to the Lord and says, skin for skin, man will do anything to preserve his own life. And that's, you didn't let me touch him, and that's why he still loves you. And so God gave the devil permission to afflict Job and not to kill him. And again, Job refuses, even after being afflicted with horrible pain and sores all over his body, again, refuses to curse God. In Job chapter 2, verse 9, his wife, who for reasons unknown is not killed, we can make assumptions though, says, do you still hold fast to your integrity, curse God and die? And that's so powerful right there, that his own wife is standing there, who she also, these are also her children and her possessions, and they're all gone. But she also is saying, curse God and die. What she's saying, what else is there for you to do? And again, it says Job refused to. He said, shall we only praise God when he gives to us and not when he takes away? And it says, in all these things, Job did not sin with his lips. And so the lesson here is that we need to accustom ourselves to being selfless under adverse conditions. And that lesson has been driven home for me when they bring us to the pool. And I hate going to the pool now because of all the things they've made us do in the pool. They make us do water confidence drills. And my least favorite one is you and a buddy, they call it buddy breathing. You and a buddy you have one snorkel between yourselves, and you're in the water, and you're supposed to pass the snorkel back and forth. And that's the only way you're going to get any air. And doing that by itself is uncomfortable, but it's doable. You can do that all day. But then the instructors are there, and they'll give you maybe a couple breaths. You pass it back and forth. As soon as you start getting in a rhythm there, they hit you. It's like a hurricane underwater, or at least I assume that's what it feels like if you're underwater. They're dunking you, they're ripping you apart, they're ripping your mask off, they're spinning you around, they push you to the bottom of the pool. And the whole time you're not allowed to come up. You have to keep passing the snorkel back and forth. And the worst thing they do is what I hate is that they cap the snorkel. So you come to get a breath and there's nothing. And the lesson there is not that I'd be able to survive a hurricane with a snorkel with another buddy. That's not, I don't think they ever anticipate us being in that situation. At least I hope I would never end up in that situation. But the lesson there is that the only way you're going to take care of yourself is if you take care of your buddy first. And that the way you're going to get oxygen is if you give your buddy oxygen. So if that happens, all you can do is give it back to them immediately. And you can then get some air back, hopefully. And so that's the lesson is that you have to take care of other people first before you take care of yourself. And they do that by putting you in the most stressful situation that they can, because the pool is the only place that they can make you think that your life is actually in danger. Because you can hurt all day in the gym, but you never actually feel like your life is in any sort of danger. But in the pool, they can start simulating that a bit more. And so that's how the military has decided we're going to teach people to take care of each other before they take care of themselves. But in the Bible, we see that again, that you have to be completely selfless. And so Job, even when everything's taken away from him, knows that at the end of the day, God is in control. So that's the first point there, is to be utterly selfless, especially when things are going wrong. Not just when things are going wrong, but especially when things are going wrong. The second point is that we need to be continually growing. As soon as you stop growing, then you stop trying. The day it becomes easy is the day that you stop trying. I like to snowboard, and when I started learning how to snowboard, it was very, very painful because all you do is fall and get up, and then you fall and get up, and you fall and get up, and eventually you start putting together some of the pieces, and then you go down the harder course, and then you fall and get up, and you fall and get up. And my dad always told us, if you're not falling, you're not learning. And so the same thing applies to our life. That's why growth of any sort is painful, whether it's physical, spiritual, mental growth is always going to hurt. It's why learning, sometimes you come out and you're just, okay, I need to take a break for a little bit. Or in the gym, that's why it hurts when you're lifting. And so in Judges chapter 6, we see a real example. What does that look like though on a spiritual level? What does it mean to continually grow spiritually? And so Judges 6, verse 12, we see Gideon threshing wheat in his wine press. And he's threshing wheat in a wine press so that they don't see the cloud of the chaff rising up, so that the Midianites wouldn't see that, because as soon as they know that it's the harvest season, the Midianites would come to Israel, kill them, take all their food, take all their possessions, and leave. And there's nothing the Israelites could do about it. And so Gideon is trying to conceal the fact that he's harvesting grain so that he could have something to eat. And this is our introduction to Gideon. This is him hiding and trying to draw as little attention to himself as possible. But it says an angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, the Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. And I can imagine Gideon looking around thinking, where is this valiant warrior? And so the angel of the Lord tells him to go up against Midian. And he says, how am I supposed to do that? The angel of the Lord says to him, go in the strength that the Lord is giving you. But Gideon says, I'm the least of my clan, and my clan is the least of Manasseh. How are we supposed to rise up against Midian? And he says, if the Lord is with us, how have all these bad things happened to us? He says, if this is the same Lord that drew us up out of Egypt, why is the Lord now forsaken us? It's a conversation that Gideon had in verses 12 and 13 with the angel. But again, he asked for a sign then afterwards. So not only has the angel of the Lord appeared to him, but then he asked for a sign to say, if you really are who you say you are, prove it. And so the angel does, and in verse 17 provides him with a sign. And so Gideon then believes that this is really the Lord talking to him. And then he goes and is commanded to tear down an altar of Baal. And so he goes and destroys the altar. But in verse 27, it makes sure to clarify that he does it at night because he's fearful of his father and he's fearful of the people of the city. And so he goes and does it, but he does it at night. And then later on, the people confront him about it, and he admits to it that he did it, and that he did it at night because he was fearful. And later on, he again asks the Lord to provide him with signs. In verse 36, he says, well, if the Lord is truly with me, provide me with the sign. And he lays out the fleece on the grass and says, well, if in the morning the fleece is dry and the grass is wet, I'll believe that you're with me. And that happens. And then he's still not satisfied, and continue on to verse 40. He again asks well, if I put the fleece out on the grass, and if the fleece is wet and the grass is dry in the morning, then I'll believe that the Lord is with me. And then the Lord obliges him again. And again, I don't think Gideon is convinced, but he raises up an army. And we see in chapter 7, verses 2-8, we see that Gideon raises up an army of 32,000 men, which is sizable. But when they see the size of the army of Midian, they see that it's as numerous as the sand on the seashore, and their horses are like locusts. And so God says, your army is too large. If I give Midian into your hand, you'll say that you did it on your own, with your own strength. And so he cuts down his army to 300 men. And it's significant here, though, that Gideon trusts God enough to do this without saying anything. He goes from tearing down an altar, but at night, to cutting down his army from 32,000 to 300 without complaint, without saying anything. And so we see that Gideon's making some progress here. He goes from cowering in a wine press, draws as little attention as himself as possible, to leading an army. That in itself is growth there. But from there, God, I believe, still thinking Gideon is nervous about this, says to him, Gideon doesn't say anything first, but God goes to him and says, if you still don't believe that I've given Midian into your hand, go down to the camp of the Midianites. And we see in chapter 7, verses 10-15, that's what he does, bringing a servant. And he hears a couple of them talking about a dream that they had. And only then is he fully convinced that God has given Midian into his hand. And after that, they have a battle. Gideon wins and is pursuing then the kings of Midian with their remaining forces. And he's pursuing 15,000 men still. So you could say, okay, well, Gideon with his 300 men surprised this army and they won this battle. But then in the morning, he's still chasing after 15,000 men with only 300. And that is also significant to then do it in the daylight, when the army of Midian can turn around and see probably there's only 300 of them, but they're still fleeing from them. And he goes and twice is turned away at different cities of the Israelites. Usually we stop the story. Gideon wins this battle and he's a hero. And that's usually where we end the story. But the story continues that he goes on and at 2 different cities is turned away. And he's asking, can my men have something to eat or to drink? We've been running and chasing this army for days. And they both say to him, essentially, are the heads of the kings of Midian already in your hands that we should help you? And so they both turn him away. And both times he promises retribution on them, and he goes and destroys the remaining forces of Midian and comes back to both of these cities and then destroys them as well. And again, just the complete 180 we see in Gideon here, that he goes from, again, hiding to destroying an altar, to leading an army, to leading this small army, to fighting this huge invasion force, to winning, to being spurned then by the rest of Israel and coming back. I think that's an incredible example of spiritual growth there. But a New Testament example also would be Jesus himself. Matthew chapter 3, he in verse 17, he's baptized, and the Lord immediately after Jesus is baptized says, this is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. Already he's saying, you've done a good job. But immediately after that, for chapter 4, verses 1-11, we see the story of Jesus in the wilderness, where he's tempted for 40 days and 40 nights. And it said that he did this immediately after being baptized. And at this time, Jesus wasn't very well known, didn't really have disciples at this point, hadn't begun his ministry. But he's testing himself. And it said that he was led by a spirit into the desert, chapter 4, verse 1. He's led by a spirit into the desert in order to be tempted, in order to be tested. He's not, these two things are going together here. He's already done something well that the Lord has acknowledged publicly, that for all people to see that this is something that he's done well. But then he takes it a step further and says, I'm going to go test myself now. And only then does he begin his ministry, after 40 days and 40 nights of being without food and then being tested by the devil himself. And again, this is important even today for congregations to take this principle. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 2, Paul writes to the church at Corinth and says, I have fed you with milk and not meat because you are not ready for it. And even now you are not ready for it. He's saying that I've given you the easy things to do, the easy things to learn, because you weren't ready for the more difficult concepts. And even now you're not ready for them, because he sees that the church at Corinth is rife with conflict. They were not continually growing. He had already come to them and taught them and he saw the state of their church, and they were not continually growing. That's what happens when you're not continually growing. You're going to stagnate. And so that's why it's important to continually try and to test yourself. And we see that in the Old Testament, Gideon, and we see that in the New Testament with Jesus, and we see that again in the New Testament at the church at Corinth, why that is important for them to do. And my last point then would be that leaders have to be willing to do whatever they ask others to do, that they have to lead from the front. And again, this also goes back to being selfless. You're not going to ask others to do what you're not willing to do yourself. The example when I was still studying leadership, and one of the examples I found was a military one, but it's from World War II. General at the time was Major Curtis LeMay, and he was in charge of a bomber wing in Europe. And the daylight bombing raids over Europe were disastrous for the Allied bombers. The casualty rate was incredibly high, over 50%. But the deal was, if you did so many missions, you did X amount of missions, you were allowed to go home for a while, and then you would come back. And so everyone is just saying, well, if my job is just to fly out, drop bombs, and leave, why? A lot of them would drop bombs early. A lot of them would not even fly over the target, but then it would still get checked off as a mission that they flew. So then why would they fly over the most dangerous part? And so General LeMay gets this report back of incredibly high abort rates for all the missions, and all the pilots come back and say, well, it's too dangerous, and then we couldn't fly over there, so we dropped bombs on secondary targets and then came back. And so when he saw the abort rate, he said, well, I'm going to be in the lead bomber in every single raid, and if I see any of you abort, I'm going to court-martial you myself when we get back. And so there he was, and they always noted that he had a big cigar and was always in the lead plane on every mission. And I can't even imagine this being done nowadays. But again, to say that I'm going to be on the lead plane on every mission where you flip a coin or greater, I think it was closer to 60 or 70% would get shot down at some point during these missions. And to say that I'm going to be in the lead plane on every single one of those is pretty courageous there. But again, how is this biblical? To lead from the front is something that we see continually during the New Testament, I think, and during the Old Testament. But Paul, in particular, goes and founds at least 14 congregations that we see in the New Testament. I think that we could probably put that number a bit higher, because when he goes to a city, say Corinth, say any other city that he goes, it says he founds the church there. It's probably several congregations there, because people are meeting in different homes. It's not just one church there. So it's probably, we have at least 14 congregations, but it's probably much higher than that. And that takes a lot of leadership there. And a lot of people might say, well, if I could perform miracles, then sure, I can go and found congregations too. I can go preach the word if I could perform miracles like Paul could. But I don't think that's true. We see Elijah in 1 Kings 19. We see his challenge with the prophets and priests of Baal. And we see he wins this great victory for God and for the Israelites that still believe in God when he calls down fire and the prophets of Baal are consumed by it. But just after that, 1 Kings 19, verse 2, Jezebel sends him a letter and says, may the gods deal with me, may it be ever so severely, if I don't make your life like that of one of theirs by this time tomorrow. And so Elijah, you would think, after having called down fire and won this battle against hundreds of prophets of Baal, you'd think he wouldn't be fazed by a letter like this. But what does he do? Verses 3 and 4, it says then that he runs for his life, and he takes his servant, and when they get to Beersheba, he leaves his servant, and then goes another day's journey out into the wilderness. And underneath the juniper tree, he stops, and he says, Lord, I've had enough. Take my life, for I'm no better than one of my fathers. And then he's asking that he dies. He says, I'm done. And then he realizes that he's messed up, that after winning this great victory for the Lord, then that he goes and immediately flees. And then I think he's ashamed. I think he realizes what he's done. But then at that point, he's saying, what else is there for me to do? Again, just like Job's wife told Job, now Elijah is saying, what else is there for me to do but die? And the Lord again comes and talks to them. His angels come and minister to him. But again, that's to illustrate the point that I don't think that just as someone has miraculous abilities that they are automatically would be a good leader. That Paul, his ability to found all these congregations wasn't because of his miraculous abilities, but because Paul was a solid leader and was able to go and continually endure hardship in order to found all these different congregations in order to spread church and the word in its infancy there in the first century. And so Paul tells us 1 Corinthians 11:1, again, back to his letter to the church at Corinth. He says, follow my example as I followed the example of Christ. Okay, well, what is the example of Paul? Well, Paul lays out his example in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 27. He says, I've worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I've labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and I have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily pressure and concern for all the churches. So we see all the things that Paul has endured, despite the fact that he has these miraculous powers, that he's able to perform powers with the Holy Spirit. And so we see, again, what does it come down to? That's Paul's example. And he says, follow my examples. I follow the example of Christ. Well, then what, again, I ask, what then is the example of Christ? It would be John chapter 15, verses 11 to 13. This is my command, that you love one another just as I've loved you. No greater love is man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And later on, he's foreshadowing in John chapter 15 towards what is to come, and his disciples still don't understand what he's talking about. And we see later on, Matthew chapter 27, verse 32, is Jesus carrying his cross on the way to be crucified. And verse 32 mentions that Simon of Cyrene is then called to help him carry it. I think we can surmise because he was not able to at that point. After being flogged, after being beaten, and then to carry his cross and to know furthermore what was to come at the end of that walk is powerful. And that's the example of Christ that Paul is emulating, that we are also called to emulate, and as leaders are expected to, and to have so that no one else can look and say, you haven't done this, you haven't done X, Y, Z. Why are you able to be in charge of me? Why are you a proper example of Christ then? And to carry something heavy like that to where you can't anymore is also incredibly painful. I think we overlook that. We see Jesus being scourged, we see him being beaten, but if you carry something heavy enough to where it forces you to your knees, feels like every bone in your body is about to explode. It's your whole existence is pain in that moment, and all you can think about is getting it off your back. And that's the example of Christ then that we're called to follow, and that's powerful there. And so again, every day we're called to be leaders in Christ. And so really those are the 3 points I had then, that we're called to be selfless, we're called to continually grow, and that we are called to be leaders, to do what we ask others to do. And so just really, again, like I said at the beginning, I don't think you can do one of those without doing the others. I don't see how you can be a leader who's willing to do what you ask others to do, or you have done what you're asking others to do, and to not be selfless. I don't see how you can be selfless and then ask someone to do something you haven't asked yourself to do. I don't see how you can be selfless and be a good leader and not be always testing yourself, trying to grow. I don't see how you can do any of those things without doing the others. And these are all concepts that are being taught in the secular world, but again, are all biblical concepts. And we see examples that are far more powerful in the Bible. And there's so many that I would like to go through and talk about, but we only have so much time. But there's another quote at the end that I thought was powerful, interesting, is that President Garfield was our 20th president of the United States. And when he became president, he said that he resigned from the greatest office on earth to become president of the United States. And he was an elder in the Church of Christ. And that's what he was talking about. And you see the onus that is put on our leaders, to be servants of the Lord first, and to then take care of his flock. That is the burden of leadership that leaders in the church bear. And so, again, even though if you're not in a leadership position within the church, we are all called to be examples of Christ, to be the light unto the world, the salt of the earth, to let our light shine before other men. And so that's why it's incredibly important to understand these things, so that maybe you'll be a leader in the future, or even if you never are, even if you're just a Christian, but you're letting your example shine before other men every single day. And if they know you're a Christian, they're always going to be looking at you to see exactly what you're like and see if you fall short. So that's why it's important to understand these things. That's why it's important to constantly grow and to be selfless and to constantly lead from the front as a Christian out in the world. So those are the points I had today. We're going to offer the invitation. If there's anyone here that has need of it, whether for baptism, whether for prayer, come forward now as we stand and sing.